My parents decided to divorce when I was 9, and the plan called for equal sharing of custody. I lived with my mother, whose house was near my school during the week, then spent the weekends with my dad. My parents stayed nice and compassionate toward me despite their distance, which helped me to find the change more pleasant. I knew they both loved me very much, even though I was depressed and they were not together. When I turned 11, my dad brought me Natalie, a woman he had been seeing for some time. This started things to shift. Originally, she seemed friendly, and seeing how delighted she made my dad, I really wanted to like her. At the time, Natalie had 2 daughters, 14-year-old Riley and Chloe. Unlike me, who was naturally quiet, they were noisy and demanding, constantly throwing fits should things go wrong. I watched all of this silently, feeling awkward, but not wishing to cause disturbance. My dad told me he and Natalie were getting married after a year of dating. When they tied the knot, I was 12. Even my mother went, out of respect for my dad and in hopes of preserving some unity for my benefit. The prospect of a new family first thrilled me, since it meant that things might at last feel whole once again. It even seemed as though Natalie and I could get along for the first few months. But the fantasy broke soon after their honeymoon. Natalie followed me one morning when my dad was not around. She informed me she didn't like me and that she was simply acting friendly for my dad's benefit, and her voice was frigid. Her eyes narrowed as she continued. "When he's not here, keep out of my way." The remarks cut deep, more than I could realize at the moment. "I find it intolerable even to look at you. You are too much like your mother." The brittle optimism I had created for a quiet new family life cracked. Riley and Chloe witnessed the discussion, and after that day, they would seize every chance to make fun of me, saying, "Dad doesn't love you as much as he loves us," grinning and pushing me almost to tears. Unable to keep my hurt bottled up, I informed my mother about it on one of our phone calls. Furious, she called my dad and confronted him, but he discounted her assertions. Sure, I had misinterpreted Natalie, and she would never say such things. The following time I arrived, Natalie's attitude changed from cool apathy to direct animosity. She remained quiet when my dad was around, but the instant he left, she leaned in and said that if I ever spoke to my mother about her once more, she would make sure I lost Dad permanently. She snarled, "If you don't keep quiet, I'll leave him and take all he possesses." At 12, I felt imprisoned, afraid to speak out, and terrified of starting any more strife that may endanger my dad. My life with Natalie turned into continual misery from then on. She called me names, insulted me, and denigrated me at every chance. In spite of all this, I silently convinced myself that things would change finally. Natalie would act like a loving stepmother, taking me and her girls shopping and dining whenever my dad was available, all while running all of her expenses on his credit card. She never let me order much, only soup or a dessert. My stomach throbbing with hunger and my eyes burning with quiet humiliation, I would watch silently as others savored complete meals. The toughest aspect was having to go to bed hungry. Usually, more often than not, following a day of muttered insults and acts of exclusion, I would lie in bed hungry and worn out. Overwhelmed by fear, resentment, and grief, I would weep myself to sleep. Ignorant of this, my dad kept believing we were fitting a happy family. Once the school week ended, Friday evenings became my least favorite time of the week. Often attempting to come up with excuses like pretended stomach aches to avoid attending, I hated going to see my dad. My parents observed my hesitancy, and my dad would call, his voice laced with sadness, asking why I wasn't eager to come. Concerned and pushing me to tell her if something was really wrong, my mom would press me. But the fear of Natalie's threats kept me silent. My need to speak up was subordinated to my fear of conflict and my dad's happiness. When I reached 14, my dad decided to take us all on a family holiday to Greece. But my silence just served to enable Natalie's vicious actions, allowing her to further abuse me in the shadows. It piqued little interest for me. My mom urged me to go even though I knew a week with Natalie and her girls, Riley and Chloe, would be terrible. She continued, trying to inspire me. "It's a chance to see the world." I reluctantly consent. Natalie maintained her flawless behavior from the beginning. She spoke softly and asked about school as though she really cared. She did, however, carefully weave her comments with subdued digs. Though I was already above normal height for my age, my mother would remark things like, "Oh, you should be taller if you want to play that sport," if I mentioned basketball. She would smile tightly, an artificial smile, and remark, "Good, focus on studies, you'll need it," when I mentioned my grades, which exceeded Riley's and Chloe, S. Riley, and Chloe were not much better. They would giggle if Natalie said something dishonest and called me names like meathead. Blind to it all, my dad would advise me to loosen up if I suggested their remarks hurt. He would shrug and remark, "They're just teasing," as though that would make everything better. Natalie would chuck in, "You know, you have to learn to take a joke. Have some fun." I would sit there, the taste of wrath and powerlessness weighty in my lips. One afternoon in the pool, things boiled to the surface. I attempted to savor a rare moment of tranquility while the sun was high and the lake glittered. Naturally, though, it did not last. Before beginning their regular taunting, Natalie and the twins sauntered up, lounging next to me and flashing stares. They went for my weight this time, whispering and chuckling just loud enough for me to hear. I snapped something inside of me. I glanced to Riley and Chloe. Their haughty faces no longer seemed very hilarious. My voice was icy. "At least I don't have double chins that jiggle when I laugh." Their smiles disappeared, and they turned to face me in startled, quiet. As Natalie learned the twins were mute, her face clouded. I turned to her, years of repressed resentment bubbling to the top. "And you shouldn't bother with that shrug over your bikini," I shouted, not caring if my voice shook with rage. "Nothing is covered by it." "You still seem to be a penguin." Before she swung on her heel and rushed back to the hotel, her face had a priceless, brilliant red and ferocious appearance. The twins screamed about how sexist and nasty I was and yelled every name they could think of. My dad wasn't happy when he discovered it not long afterward. His expression tight. He drew me away that evening. "Did you actually say those things to the girls and Natalie?" His voice shrill as he questioned. I straightforward rather than lie. "I did indeed. But you never see them. They have been mocking me for years." My voice trembled, part wrath, part desperation. But regardless of the provocation, my dad merely shook his head and chastised me for not talking to women like that. "I raised you better," he remarked, disappointment running over every syllable. He made me apologize to Natalie, who had closed herself in the bathroom, acting to be in tears. Knowing it was an act, I said the words anyhow and felt them turn to ash on my mouth. Of course, Natalie gave a great performance, accepting my apologies, blotting at her eyes and sighing dramatically. Riley and Chloe were at her side, gazing at me like I had done some unforgivable sin. I told my mother all when I got home. Her eyes focused intently as I related the taunting, the humiliation, and my dad's denial of seeing what was happening. She called him, and the exchange descended into a shouting fight as my mother threatened to have Child Protective Services involved should Natalie so much as glance at me once more go wrong. My dad had to have been afraid of losing everything since Natalie stopped openly insulting me later on. But her quiet treatment, the icy looks and whispering the twins would do whenever my dad was away, never stopped. I came to live with it. I almost had numbness by the time I was 16. I stayed low and out of Natalie's path. I stayed with my dad since my mom had to spend some days away from town. Natalie whined on the last night about having to cook for me, so I opted to make dinner myself. Wanting me to be independent, my mom had taught me to cook when I was little. When Natalie said she was inviting some friends over, I set aside a basic dinner to present. As they sampled the cuisine, I recall the look of amazement on everyone's face that sent compliments pouring in from all directions. Feeling a little glow of pride, I retreated to my room as my dad volunteered to finish the dishes. That luminosity did not last. Moments later, voices outside my window, Natalia's voice over all others. She whispered, hatred slithering every word. "I can't stand him. I can't wait until he's 18, so I don't have to see his face anymore." One of her friends whispered something about how pleasant I seemed, and Natalie laughed. I wanted him to mess dinner so I could accuse him of ruining the evening. The remarks really hit like a punch. I never knew enough. All I did was attempt to be courteous and out of her way. My heart thumping, I sat there going back over her words. I would never be welcome at that house no matter how hard I tried. As time went on and I entered college, my visits to my dad's house were less frequent. Not facing Natalie or her girls, Riley and Chloe, was a relief. But when I did visit, the customary coolness in the air came back right away. Natalie would simply disregard me completely. She no longer bothered with barely veiled comments. She would set dinners or trips with my dad and the twins, thus casually neglecting to invite me. She would chastise me, calling me lazy, even if I was careful to tidy up after myself, and keep out of the way if I happened to wake late during my breaks at home. Though I tried to be polite, Natalie found means to make me feel excluded. She would occasionally barge into my room without knocking, wake me suddenly, or search among my belongings without reason. Though I never knew what she was looking for, it made me uncomfortable and on edge. She made sure beneath my dad's roof, I felt like a stranger. Many evenings, I would hear my dad, Natalie, and the twins laughing together from my room, the solitude enveloping me like a heavy blanket. But turning 21 was the pivotal event that turned all around. With a happy voice, my dad called to let me know he wanted me to visit for the weekend, and he had something significant to talk about. He sounded so eager a long time ago, and my mom urged me to go, hoping things would improve. I thus reserved my tickets and set out. My dad welcomed me kindly at the airport when I arrived, something that reminded me of the dad I used to know, the one who was always there when I was younger. The ride back was light, full of small conversation. When I asked what the news was, he merely grinned and said he would tell it over dinner. That evening, we sat all around the dining table. Riley and Chloe sitting across from me after so much seemed unusual. Though they were in their mid-20s today, their attitude had not changed. They hardly noticed me. Natalie watched me with those icy eyes seated at the head of the table. Rising, my dad cleared his voice and started talking. He gazed directly at each of us, even smiling at Natalie to get my gut to turn. His voice softened, and for a brief moment I felt the usual warmth I had long missed. I've been thinking a lot lately about what really matters and how lucky I am to have such a wonderful family, he said. Lost an old friend lately and came to see how crucial organization is. When this was mentioned, Natalie's face brightened up, and the twins straightened in their seats, their eyes glittering with expectation. My dad said, "I've made a will," and I watched Natalie's smile go wider. Declaring it a means of ensuring Natalie and the twins were safe, he described how he would leave the house for her. She flashed triumph in her eyes as she beamed and sought for his hand. Then he turned to me, and to my son, "I'm leaving my retirement account and my car." The words struck me like a tsunami. This was not any car. This was the vintage car he had rebuilt over years, the one he used to share memories from his early years. It represented what we had experienced before Natalie entered our life. I developed a knot in my throat and felt a range of emotions almost ready to explode. I looked at the twins and Natalie. Their smiles had failed, replaced with tight-lipped looks. Riley and Chloe looked quickly and silently at one another. Ignorant of the mounting conflict, my dad continued, outlining how he intended the twins to split the shared joint bank account. He comforted them, knowing they would have money to safeguard their future and a home over their heads. The twins did not satisfy themselves. Chloe slanted forward, her voice harsh. "Still, why does he have the retirement account?" "We need more than that," Riley added, supporting her. "Exactly. We are ladies. We need more financial stability. He needs it less as well." I sat there, astounded as their entitlement came out. Natalie paused to fan the flames and turned to look disappointedly at my dad. "As you know, they are correct. He is a man. He is able to look after himself. More is needed by the girls. The smile of my dad dimmed as he shook his head. "My decision has already been taken. It's final. The room went quiet for a little period. Natalie's face then crumpled out of nowhere, and she began to cry. Real, deep sobbing that produced an unpleasant, echoing sound around the room. Wearing a concerned expression, my dad stretched out, "What's wrong, Natalie?" Confusion evident in his voice, he asked. She choked off the words between sobs and cleaned at her eyes. "I cannot keep this in for very long. My heart fell into my gut. I have been shielding this family for far too long." I glanced nervously at my dad, who seemed as perplexed as I felt. Natalie gasped shakily and began to construct a story so bizarre that my brain whirled. She said that following our trip to Greece years ago, I was trying to push her on. Her falsehoods fell out of her mouth so naturally, creating me as some sort of predator who had terrorized her behind closed doors. The twins sat there, mouths gaping in imitation shock. Playing precisely frozen comma, my brain battled to keep up with the charges. "That isn't accurate!" My voice rough with incredulity, I yelled. "She is lying!" Natalie went on, though, explaining to my dad how she had kept it a secret for years and just spoken out now to protect her girls and herself from more terror. Inspired by her display, the twins turned angrily toward me. Riley spat and said, "You monster! Get out of our house!" Looking at my dad, I hoped for even a flutter of uncertainty, but he merely stared at me, caught and mute. At last, he said, his voice low and strained, "Leave James," said I should consider Dot. It was as if a punch to the chest. It amazed me. My own father chose to believe the lies rather than the son he reared. I got ready, my vision fogging with heated tears, and left the house that used to seem like home. I headed straight to my mother's house, the one place that has ever seemed really safe. She opened the door, looking worried right away at me. I broke down, telling her everything, the lies, the treachery, the way my dad had turned away from me. For the first time in years, I felt understood as she fiercely and defensively grabbed me in an embrace. With voice trembling, "I'm done with them," I said. "I am not able to go back." And that is what I intended. The days that followed were gloomy and oppressive. I was not going to let Natalie's lies or my dad's blind belief in her break me down anymore. My dad did not get in touch. The silence was sufficient. Not only he turned away, the rest of his side of the family did as Natalie's web of falsehoods convinced them. They called my mother, hurling charges and calling me things that broke at her heart. Though it was useless, she firmly defended me. The damage was done. Natalie had emerged triumphant from that struggle, and my relationship with my dad was destroyed long ago. The hurt and resentment ate me. To escape Riley, Chloe, and even Natalie's barrage of horrible books, I changed my number. Their communications, full of phrases that went deeper than I thought, made sure I was no more welcome. One of Riley's texts said, "Stay away forever." I blocked their numbers, but even that would not mute the murmurs in my mind that kept repeating their comments like an echo. "You do not belong in this family." Not only did I have loneliness, but I also suffered from anxiety. The anxiety of losing my work, my reputation, all I had created for myself, of being wrongly accused once more. I stayed away from dating and befriending fresh people. One felt a too great risk. Suppose someone else chose to turn on me as Natalie had. The idea was sufficient to keep me vigilant. My fortifications now stood higher than they had ever done. But my anchor through all was my mother. She stood beside me to assure me I wasn't by myself. She would spend evenings sitting with me as I battled the shame that threatened to engulf me completely and the nightmares. She flew in and remained with me for months when things became truly terrible and the depressed periods were so severe I couldn't see a way ahead. Her relentless presence gradually helped me to get on. Then, quite unexpectedly, it happened. I went to see Mara. She was gentle, and her grin let me see in a manner I hadn't experienced in years. I first stayed away, worried that sharing with her would just cause more suffering. She was, however, patient and sympathetic in a way that gave me security. I told her fragments of my narrative over time, and she listened without judgment. Her encouragement and consistent warmth she brought into my life began to thaw the anxiety that had frozen me for so long. My lifelines were my mom and Mara. They corrected me that not everyone was like Natalie or the twins and dragged me back into the world. I began to envisage a future in which I could create something true, something beautiful, free from historical dictate. It wasn't simple, but with them by my side, I had first-time hope in years. Suddenly, Then, I received a call from an unidentified number. Thinking it was some automated fraud or a false number, I nearly skipped responding. But something pushed me to take it up. When I did, I wasn't ready for what I heard. James. It was older, gentler, almost frail, my dad's voice. In almost 7 years, I had not heard it, and the sound instantly set forth a flood of memories and resentment. I remained quiet, waiting. When I spoke at last, my voice was frigid. "How did you come upon my number?" he asked instead. "Are you okay?" Avoiding the subject. Things unsaid filled the silence, then I murmured, "I'm good. Please do not call me once more." He broke down at that, and his sobs sounded like crackling across the telephone. His comments came out in an almost too much to absorb rush, begging for my pardon. I mistook James. "I was quite mistaken to desert you." Something in his voice stopped me, curiosity seeping through the gaps in my wrath. "Why right now?" I inquired, the inquiry weighty in the air. He shivered and related how, following years of mistrust, he discovered Natalie had been seeing his best buddy in secret. She admitted to him not only the affair, but also everything when he presented indisputable evidence. She said she had created the charges against me in order to discredit me and ensure she and her daughters would inherit anything. She seldom gave him any thought and had simply married him for his money. Listening to this, I experienced an unusual numbness. It was not my narrative. It was like hearing another person's. According to my dad, the affair caused her to walk away with nothing and led to divorce. Knowing the suffering he caused, he told me he wanted to reach out for months but was unsure how to approach me. James, I was an idiot. Right now, I see my phone pressed to my ear as I stood there, the quiet between us oppressive and relentless. When I spoke, my voice was steady. "Without thinking twice, you believed her over me. You let her sour our marriage, and now you want to come back and correct things while alone? It does not operate that way." "I know," he answered, his voice almost above a whisper, "but I'm begging you, kindly, to give me some time." I inhaled deeply, the bitterness and treachery whirling inside me. "You're not my father, not anymore. You favored her falsehoods above mine." Before he could speak another word, I cut off the phone. "That decision was yours, and so is the result." Messages from his side of the family, folks I hadn't heard from in years, abound in the following days. They told me how much my dad was suffering, how he was regretting everything, and how I was aggravating him. Reading every letter, I felt the same conflicted churn in my chest. Ultimately, though, I realized the truth. I owed him nothing. Following my dad's call, I felt both relief and weariness. I felt as though I could not completely move a book that had tormented me for years off the shelf, even though I had closed it. From his side of the family, the texts continued arriving, accusing me of being merciless and telling me that he was all alone now. Every alert tinged with remorse, but I turned off my phone since I knew their opinions had no bearing. They hadn't been there for me when I needed them. They hadn't been able to explain how I should feel right now. 1 week following that call, I realized I needed to open up in a way I hadn't done before and talk to someone about everything. Something was off, detected both my mother and Mara. I requested my mother to come. She was my safe refuge, and when she got here, Mara joined us in the living room. Years pressed on my chest, yet I knew it was time. I began gently, remembering what my dad had said when he had phoned. As my mother listened, her eyes grew stern, and rage blended with grief. Mara was clearly worried, her hand stretching out to grab mine. "He said Natalie lied about everything," I responded, my voice choking in my throat. "Now, after all these years, he is sorry." Mom started to bite her jaw. She said, hardly fighting back tears, "That woman ruined everything for you." "He also let her." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes as I at last addressed items I had buried. I told them how Natalie had controlled me when I was young, how she had threatened to leave my dad and steal everything if I spoke up, and how she had distorted reality till I questioned myself. I let it all out, the shame, the anxiety, the years of feeling unwanted. Tears came down my face by the time I was done. I could not control the cries. Mara's eyes gleamed with unshed tears as my mother drew me into her arms to soothe me. "No child should ever go through that," Mara murmured, her voice trembling with feeling. "You did not deserve any of it." The hold of my mother tightened around me, her voice kind but strong. "James, you owe nothing to him. He missed it when it counted. Now that he is lonely, he wants you back and decided to trust her lies over yours. You have no responsibility to pardon or explain." I understood they were right at that same instant. The folks who really counted were those who stood with me and believed me without question. The scars my dad caused were too deep to repair with an apology. His regret came too late. He hadn't been there when Natalie split my world apart or when I was a terrified 12-year-old. The awareness brought an unusual calm, as though a chain I had not realized had at last shattered. The weeks stretched into months, and gradually life started to alter. I began visiting a therapist, someone who guided me through the jumble of grief, anxiety, and rage. Though it hurt, discussing the past was like extracting thorns that had grown too long. I started to lighten step by step. Mara was my steady through it all. She had been the first person outside my mother to prove I was worthy of belief in. Her affection was constant, never demanding but always present, a reminder that I was not alone in having to confront life. I asked her to wed me one lovely afternoon after taking her to the park where we had first met. Her eyes brightened, and when she responded yes, it seemed as though something pure and unspoiled by the past was beginning. When I informed my mother of the news, she got excited. We discussed getting closer to her, where the schools were better, and where we would create a house for the future Mara and I envisioned. It made sense for us since both of our jobs were flexible, and the concept of starting a family close to my mother seemed right, like a circle ending in the best possible shape. I told my tale online, partly to let go of the weight still weighing me, and partly to assist anyone else perhaps experiencing something similar. The overwhelming answers were words of encouragement, tales of people who had gone through betrayal, and guidance reminding me I wasn't alone in recovering my life. Knowing that others had felt my suffering and survived it too was odd but reassuring. It was not one thing. 6 months later, life presented a different picture. I was no more that terrified child, fearing Natalie's next action or my dad's icy silence. Surrounded by the affection of my mother and Mara, I was a man broken yet rebuilt himself stronger. Therapy helped. The slow revelation that I could control my own future, not defined by what had been done to me but by what I decided to do next, also helped. I blocked the number when Dad tried to reach me last time. I had made mine recently. He had chosen his path all those years ago. Though I was learning to silence the echoes of guilt with the truth, they nevertheless periodically emerged. I owed no share of my tranquility to him or anyone else who deserted me. Now, my life was mine, based on love and loyalty strong enough to never be undermined by any falsehood. One evening, sitting with Mara and my mother, organizing our future and giggling at old tales, I realized that although the past was a part of me, it was not the full narrative. Ahead lay delight, a life worth living, and for the first time in years I was ready to welcome it. Story 2, after a girl's getaway, my entitled wife vanished. She came up at my door carrying a baby years later. I thus tore apart her life. You know how people always say things like, "I never saw it coming." For me then, that is exactly how things worked. For 4 strong years, my wife and I were joined. Married for everything. To be honest, we had a great advantage. Our whole life was plotted out in plans, and generally, I honestly felt we shared the same values. Here is the thing right now. Children were something both of us wanted. At least, when we were married, I felt we both did. We got to chatting about it, quite seriously. She would always tell how she wanted 2 or 3 children and continued on about what we would name them, how we arranged the nursery, the whole thing. She would even plan this life with our future children by sitting online, browsing at baby outfits and gadgets. It sort of fit us to discuss it, something that drew us in near proximity. So we were eager, ready to begin this next chapter together, and all appeared to be in order. Then we were faced with some terrible news that simply knocked the wind out of me. We visited a doctor to find out what was going on after several months of trying for children. To put it briefly, it was me. My count was much too low, and the doctor essentially informed us that our odds of naturally procreating were virtually none. It felt to the gut like a hit. I felt ineffectual. All those designs, we had simply gone in a flash. The news really got me down, like fairly hard. For a while I found myself in rather a poor state. Therapy turned out to be beneficial. At first, though, I was absolutely disorganized. At first, she appeared rather encouraging, stating it didn't matter and that she would be content with just the 2 of us. She expressed it in a way that seemed strange even from the start, though. She seemed to drop it far too rapidly. She was all about starting a family one minute, then she would declare she didn't need children to be happy. Not to get me wrong now. People alter their ideas, I realize. But I felt strange about her overall approach. She had gone from thinking about baby names to straightforward avoidance of any discussion of children. Not just that, but much more. It was as though she began to view me likewise. She would make these quick diggers at me out of nowhere. She would never have said before. Remarks about how I wasn't looking after myself, how perhaps I should get in shape or be more efficient around the house. Indeed, I might have gained a few pounds, but it seemed as though she was merely looking for someone to blame. She would dismiss me when I asked her what was going on with the abrupt attitude adjustment. She would tell me I was simply being too sensitive and that I was seeing things. Still, I sensed something was wrong. The woman I married used to spend hours sitting with me discussing our future. She set herself apart. She was not exact in her mien. Still, there was a coldness there. She was merely following the rules and had already checked out psychologically. And when she stated everything was good over time, I suppose I started to believe her. I stopped pressing as I wanted to come out as not needy or insecure. Still, whatever. A few years forward, and we were merely living daily. We had developed a pattern whereby we hardly spoke of anything significant. Like housemates more than husband and wife, I experimented with mentioning various possibilities. Adoption is a noun. Surrogacy. Every time she would close it, though, she would respond, "I'm happy as long as we're together," indicating she didn't want to think about it. I never bought it entirely, though. She seemed to be persuading herself more than I could. Then she tells me out of nowhere she wants to go on a girls' trip. She now regularly traveled with pals. It was not unusual. She had done it a few times before. I always encouraged her. We lived in Brighton, and she mentioned wanting to travel to America with pals for a bit. We had developed this trust throughout the years, hence, I didn't second consider it. I even made sure she had everything she needed, helped her pack, and drove her to the airport. She said something last before she went. She turned to me and remarked, "Thanks for being so helpful." Her saying it seemed a little strange to me. She seemed so real, yet I wouldn't have done anything especially unique. I dismissed it then as her simply being appreciative. To ensure things went perfectly, I stayed up that evening to be ready to contact her soon she landed. Her flight was scheduled to be roughly 9 hours, so I kept myself occupied about the house watching TV, checking the time and waiting for her to text me saying she had landed. I called her to check in once I noticed her flight had landed down. The phone rang and rang without response. I thought little of it, as I assumed she was exhausted and maybe headed straight to her hotel collapsed. Still, morning arrived, and I hadn't heard from her. I began to have this chewing anxiety in my stomach's pit. I went back to try calling. I then texted her a couple times, considering maybe her phone was on quiet or she was simply busy. But I started formally panicking after a few more hours of radio silence. To find out whether perhaps she had heard from her, I finally phoned her sister. Nothing at all. I was beginning to panic severely by now. I even went so far as phoning her pals, the ones scheduled for the trip with her. Perhaps she simply hadn't had the time to check in, or perhaps something had gone wrong with her phone. But since they weren't on the trip with her, they were perplexed too when I called them. Sitting 2 blocks back home, they were drinking coffee. That was the moment I truly understood. She was on no girls' trip. She was not surrounded by pals. She had gone nowhere with anyone. She just left. Holding the phone, I sat there and felt as though my stomach sank through the floor. My head couldn't quite grasp it. Why would she mislead me in such a manner? Why would she simply vanish without telling me? I tried to persuade myself. It was perhaps a mistake. She might have missed a connecting flight, or there might have been an emergency and she hadn't been able to phone. Deeply though, I knew she had planned this. The full girls' travel schedule is, she said, "Thanks for your encouragement." All of it was part of whatever she had been mentally creating. Uncertain of what to do, I thought I might be waking up from some dream. Not the woman I had married. I hardly knew someone like this. Every bit started to fit together. The iciness, the way she had ceased mentioning our future, those little jabs about my appearance and medical state. She had been withdrawing for some time, and I had only lately noticed it. Alternatively, perhaps I hadn't wanted to see it that evening. I just sat there expecting a text or a call, glancing at my phone. Nothing but nothing came, of course. And down inside, I realized it wouldn't. When I woke up the next morning, I recall simply lying there staring at the ceiling, hoping maybe it was all some disorganized dream. Her side of the bed, though, was empty, and reality struck hard. She had really gone. She disappeared after stuffing her luggage. And all the assurances I gave myself the evening before, maybe her phone died or she was delayed, they fell apart once more. She obviously wanted out and had planned this. I was completely in denial for the first few days. I kept phoning her, hoping to hear her on the other end. Perhaps have an explanation. I even left messages. Half the time I didn't know what to say, but I continued leaving them, hoping something might appeal to her. All I received, though, was quiet, which somehow made everything worse. It feels as though I was left to sort it out on my own without knowing what went wrong. Like I was to her all along, stranger. Her family first shared my level of shock. Her mother had not heard from her either and knew nothing about her plans. I went over there more times than I could count at finish, looking for answers, chatting with her mother. I suppose they felt sorry for me. Her mother would make dinners when I couldn't get myself to cook and let me crash there certain evenings. She would sit there listening to me discuss all the little things that didn't make sense, attempting to fit together how my life had suddenly collapsed. And to be honest, occasionally I simply sat there in silence, too numb to speak. I traveled from one extreme to another. Envy, depression, embarrassment. I would keep wondering what I had done wrong. Was there anything I missed in the signs? Was my attention toward her insufficient? There were days when I went over every conversation we had, every conflict, attempting to find out what motivated her to walk away. I was racing through my thoughts about what I could have done better to salvage our marriage. Though I could see it sounded dramatic, I became fixated on solving it. Like discovering a solution may somehow make all right. I seldom ate, hardly slept, and my job began to slide as well. People asked whether I was okay, and I would simply shrug it off, say I was handling personal affairs. Admitting what had happened made one embarrassing. To tell someone straight out that my wife vanished without a word. I did inform a few close friends eventually, and they did their best to keep me busy, dragging me out to hang around, attempting to get me moving on. Even now, though, I would be in my brain worrying about her, wondering where she was and why I wasn't enough to keep her staying. Constant questions from individuals who didn't know neighbors, relatives, friends, or even former colleagues who'd heard I was married would ask, "How is married life treating you?" One of the toughest aspects was, "And then, how is your wife?" Every time it seemed like tearing off a new scab. I would just grin and claim everything was good, as I lacked the confidence to tell them she had left. But every time I said that, life became heavier. The only thing that worked turned out to be therapy. I had never gone before, but after a few months of barely functioning, I felt I could not do it on my own anymore. I then started visiting a therapist every week, having a conversation with someone objective, someone ignorant of her, me, or any of our luggage. It worked. I would rant about the frustration, the treachery, and the hole she had left in my life. I would talk about the restless evenings and how I would lie awake, running over everything repeatedly. The therapist pointed out to me that there was no special moment meant to keep her here. She chose to go, and that was on her. Not including myself. That medication was difficult to chew. I felt for the longest period as though I had somehow driven her away from anything wrong with me. But gradually, I began to view things differently. I had simply ignored her long-standing, chilly and distant behavior. Things would improve on their own. Hoping would help. I had persuaded myself I could keep it all together, that somehow our marriage survived with just my effort. To realize it wasn't was terrible. Over time, I began to gradually reconstruct my life by tiny steps. In our marriage, I had lost a great deal of myself. I hadn't noticed until she departed. I had always been the man who tried, who would go out of his way to ensure she was content, and that our home life was pleasant. Now, though, I had all this leisure at hand and knew nothing to do with it. I so began taking up old interests once more, things I had neglected. I visited the gym, began reading books I had been postponing, and even experimented with new dish cooking. Later on, work improved as well. I was first merely going through the motions, barely keeping up with my load. But I worked harder at my job since I started feeling more like myself. Like I still had control over something in my life. It was one of the few things that made me feel successful. I had always been decent at what I did, but now I give it everything. The extra hours and the concentration are important. It paid off in the form of a promotion I never would have received had I been moping in self-pity. Still, there were some painful days. Every now and again, I would come upon something that brought her to mind. Pictures, an antique movie ticket stub, little events that triggered memories I aimed to ignore. Looking at them, I would question her activity, if she gave me any thought at all. Should she ever come to regret what she did? But those times began to disappear. Every little by bit, I could put away those memories a little faster and move a little more easily. I also caught up with friends. Not much had I seen since I married. We began once more, visiting the golf range, hiking, and engaging in activities I hadn't done in years. Having folks in my corner, people who weren't part of the mess, who could enable me to move on free from dragging me back into the agony, felt nice. In retrospect, I saw I had poured much too much of myself into that marriage, into becoming her husband. She seemed to have taken a piece of me with her when she departed, as though I had lost a great portion of who I was. Still, piece by bit, I was finding myself once more. Though it wasn't quick and it wasn't simple, I was headed there. By the end of that year, I could at last glance in the mirror and see someone who defied what she had done. I was more than just the man whose wife deserted him. I was still alive. I rebuilt and would have come out stronger. First time in years for this. I thought I could really lead my life free from her shadow hovering over me. To be honest, I took pride in that. I assumed I would be leaving everything behind. After all that turmoil, life had at last begun to seem normal, or at least as near to normal as it could get. My routine was down, friends kept me occupied, and business was really doing nicely. I would even cease daily considering her. I mean, I still had those flashes when some arbitrary recollection would find me, but it wasn't like before when every moment of my existence somehow related to her. She was therefore the last person I expected to see standing there when one Saturday morning I heard someone knock on my door. But right on my doorway she was, carrying a baby. I paused. It was like witnessing a ghost, so my brain stopped operating for a brief period. She looked essentially the same, perhaps a touch tired, but yet she looked rather the same. She looked at me as though she really felt I would be delighted to see her. And yes, that really hurt me, as I felt I was past caring. As it happened, meeting her again set off a lot of feelings I had buried. First of all, I said nothing. I just stood staring at them. She gave me a smile akin to nothing having happened. She then asked, "Zero shame? Might I come in?" The nerve is really, after all she has done, she simply shows up here like I should welcome her back with open arms. Still, I remained composed. Told her no. You may stay right there and explain. Her presence in my house brought all that anarchy back into the house I had rebuilt. I wanted her out of it. One area I had designated. She seemed a little off balance, but she stayed where she was and dug right into her narrative. She began, I wanted to come back and explain everything, which I knew would be shocking. She even looked with optimism, as if she really thought I would be receptive to her. Laughing in her face and just closing the door right there conflicted with each other. But my curiosity drove me too far. I wanted to hear her justification, what she had come up with to defend her disappearance. She continued talking about how she had realized she had lost the best thing that had ever occurred to her, and about how she had made a mistake leaving. Not my words, hers. She claimed to have spent a lot of time thinking and that she finally realized what truly mattered in life after having this child. Apparently, after ghosting me for years, showing up unannounced at my door became really important. She then dropped her gaze down at the infant and declared, "This is our second chance." What I was hearing still astounds me. Like this child, who was intended to be some magical reset button, our second opportunity starts exactly where we left off. Though I attempted to keep my expression calm, emotionally I was furiously angry. She continued, asking us to once more be a family. She had obviously made a mistake. But right now we might start a new together, just the three of us. At last, I voiced the one question that had been chewing at me since she arrived. You left for what? Though I kept my voice as calm as I could, I wasn't sure how long I could resist. Years of trying to grasp and tormenting myself with all the possibilities have gone toward this, and I needed to hear it from her now she was here. She stopped, gazing down at her feet as though she were embarrassed. Eventually, though, she gave me the truth. That which I had imagined to be true. She said she had left as she wanted a child, and since I could not provide her one, she had found someone else who could. She said it exactly as if it were not really important, as if her breaking of my life hadn't happened, as if I was meant to merely nod and let it go. She said the man she had left with vanished, but by then she had the kid and knew she wanted me back. Like that. Straightforward. I paused to let her words sink in here. She was running off with some guy, having her kid, and now expected me to be cool with it, admitting she had dropped me. Like I simply forget and forgive. I inform her. You went, met someone else, had his baby, and now you want to come back and act as though nothing happened? She began to cry, apologizing for making such a big mistake, but it had no effect on me. She continued repeating how she came to know I was the one she really loved and how we were supposed to be together. To be honest, maintaining a straight face was difficult. Her sounds as if she were quite deluded. Love is not what this was. This was desperation, and her expression showed it all the time. She then tried to guilt-trip me about how difficult it had been for her, how different it had been for a single mother. She really aimed to become the victim in all this, as though her decisions had not resulted in exactly where she was now. She urged me. She was ready to make things work this time, and she wanted my help. I kept wondering all through that, who does she believe me to be? I was done listening at this point, even though I was standing there soaking up everything. I gave her straightforward directions. Look, you had to live with your decision long ago when it was made. Here, there is not a second chance. She seemed stunned, like she never would have ever thought about. No would be my answer, like she truly believed she could simply walk back into my life since it was convenient for her. She then became enraged just when I believed she would at last understand and depart. Her voice shifted, and she began screaming at me, calling me selfish, that I owed her a chance to fix things. She stated she could have taken half of everything and split from me back then if she had wanted. She even had the guts to bring up the house, declaring it still hers. I got this sense of comfort as her actual hues seemed to be right in front of me. At last I was seeing her for the true her. I never got into arguments with her. I held back from speaking up. We're done, I said, merely looking at her. You sought a different way of life, and right now you have it. These days I have fewer responsibilities. I so cut off any last words she had left by closing the door in her face. Standing there, she hears muffled yells coming from the other side of the gate. This unusual peace came over me. She may bang, yell, cry, whatever. I knew, though, I would never allow her back in. The lady I had loved and the woman I had married. She left. And in her place was the stranger who felt she might gather the fragments when it suited her. Feeling less than I have in years, I turned away from the door and sat down. I believed that was it once I shut her door. She would get the message, I reasoned, and simply leave. Not so sure, though. She began instead pounding on the door and screaming all kinds of things. I found the nerve to be unbelievable. I was at the one spot that belonged to me there, one location I had managed to reconstruct from her chaos left behind. She also had the nerve to stand there asking I pay attention. At first, I considered ignoring it, simply letting her yell till she tired. Then, though, I started to become interested. I wanted to know the kind of justifications she would have generated this time. I opened the door with just a crack sufficient to indicate I was listening, but I was not inviting her in. She appeared as though she had just slapped her face, presumably startled that I hadn't responded the way she had hoped. She started this entire diatribe about how she was ready to start over, like we were just having a normal spat, not dealing with her abandonment, and on how she was ready to forgive me for slamming the door on her Dot. She persisted on how we might make things work if we both worked at it. I could not hold back at that point. I chuckled and really laughed, as the mere nerve of this woman was beyond anything I had ever seen. When I did that, she turned red. Like I should have felt for not giving her any importance. You left, I said to her. You tossed it all away after having your chance. You feel like it, so I am not merely going to pretend none of it happened. Her face flushed, and she began to say things like, "You don't know how hard it was for me." She continued on describing how she'd been so lost after leaving, and how she'd come to know too late she had made a mistake. But I wasn't buying it. I reminded her that leaving was a decision she took. She had planned it, lied about it, then carried out it. Her regret has nothing bearing on anything. Presently. And she snapped at it as well. Her whole voice shifted. She abandoned the depressed, regretful deed and began to follow me, complaining about how unfair I was and how I lacked respect to give her another chance. She had the audacity to ask whether I would want to. From you back then, I could have taken everything. I could have grabbed half of all you own. I just stood there in wonder. This woman who had left me without saying now felt she was due some sort of compensation for not trying to wreck me financially, like she deserved credit for not being as horrible as she could have been. So what am I meant to be grateful for? I asked her. Thank you for just throwing me aside and not carrying my belongings with you. She looked at me, her face a mix of wrath and something more. Perhaps shame, perhaps desperation or guilt. Actually, though, by then I had no interest. Just finished. Over all those years, I would have felt bad, questioned myself, and wondered whether I might have had some influence on her leaving. They faded away right away. At last, I saw her for who she was, and it seemed as though the weight I had been dragging around was at last released. She wasn't done, though. Starting on my porch, she began pacing about how I would regret not giving her another chance and how I would never meet someone like her. Not taking her back, she really attempted to make me feel as though I was the one missing out. It was odd. Here she was, the person who wrecked everything we owned, acting as though I ought to be pleading with her to remain. She grew even louder, going on about how I'd pushed her to go in the first place when she saw I wasn't moving. None of this would have happened, she said, if I had been more sympathetic about the entire kid thing. Her reasoning seemed to be that my failure to provide her a kid meant I had failed her as a spouse, which somehow explained her fleeing to have one with someone else. The mental gymnastics were very amazing. To be honest, I found it hard to understand she was blaming me for her decisions. Tell her straight out, hey, if you wanted a kid that badly, you could have told me the truth. While you were organizing your departure, you did not have to lie to my face and act as though everything was good. She said nothing at all to that, just watched me like I had slapped her, but I let her get no words in at all. You made that decision all on your own, I told her, and now you have to live with it. I have no trouble with that. She asked me to consider the youngster and how I was being unjust by turning my back on him after trying one final angle and returning to her depressed face. She actually used the child she was holding to guilt-trip me like I was the terrible man here. Still, I wasn't drawn in by it, I informed her, not sure that child. Nothing about me relates to him. Neither of you nor him is mine. And with that, that was it. For her, I could see the awareness at last sinking. She understood I wouldn't be changing my mind, and that I couldn't let her back into my life. I could see something else replacing the wrath as it subsided. Perhaps only frustration, perhaps true regret. Still, it was not important to me. Now she was simply a stranger. A stranger expected me to grin and thank her for trying to walk all over me. She stayed there for a few more seconds, as though she were waiting for me to call her back from change of mind backtracking. Still, I said no more words. I simply stood there, seeing her expression when at last she realized I meant every word. I closed the door then, without another glance, and this time I didn't wait for her to pound it once more. Deep down, I realized I had decided, and there was no turning back. I turned away from the door, feeling, I suppose, like I would have at last won. She had invested so much time wondering whether she could return and control her path into my life once more. But it was ending. I belonged free. Second chances were not going to exist, not for us or for her. She was only a memory now, when I would at last put the past where it belonged. After all those years of shame and suffering, I at last felt as though I could breathe. Also, comma. You know what? It was fantastic. I experienced an unusual calm as soon as I closed that door on her. I was not astonished anymore, nor furious or depressed. It was as if every bit of the vitality I had devoted to her over years, every regret, every guilt, every constant wondering, it really disappeared. I felt ready to go forward after at last obtaining the closure I had been missing. It had ended. Actually, this time. Naturally, though, things did not finish as neatly as I had intended. A few days later, her mother texted me. She was apologizing, saying she attempted to speak some sense into her, but she felt embarrassed about how her daughter had handled everything. Clearly, it had not worked. Her mother was a decent woman. After her daughter departed, she had been quite helpful to me. I could see she was really unhappy about the whole thing. Though I had nothing against her, I was not interested in being pulled back into that situation. I simply said a courteous thank you for following up and left it there. I was not going to waste time outlining my choice. I was not going to provide her mother any more specifics. She knew enough to be aware it was finished. I heard fragments over the course of several weeks via social media and common connections. She apparently had trouble returning to live with her parents. The child's father, the man she had left me for, was hardly involved. He would have totally dropped out. I suppose he hadn't registered for long-term. She was now caught working it out on her own. She had essentially destroyed every bridge, so few people would be eager to help. Her former pals, those on my side when she vanished initially, showed no pity for her. They had all moved on and showed no enthusiasm for being pulled back into her drama. Not able to attribute blame to them. Not exactly delighted either were her parents. Their financial situation wasn't great enough to support her and a child. I knew this as I got a call from her dad, not long after the book her mother sent. Though I nearly missed it, curiosity won out. He was courteous but direct, indicated they were having financial difficulties, and made hints suggesting perhaps I could assist somewhat. He replied, "We know you cared for her once," and carried on talking about the child and how difficult life was for them. I listened politely, but I couldn't help but chuckle a little when he started talking about how his daughter simply needed a little help to get back on her feet. Not spoken out, but you understand. I gently reminded him that his daughter made her decisions. I was not in a position or mindset to be of assistance. Given he refrained from pressing ahead, I believe he understood the message. Her pals start contacting me next thing. Individuals I had not heard from in years. A few attempted the guilt route, claiming she was going through a difficult period, and maybe I could find it in my heart to offer her another chance. Another friend of hers even dared to advise that the child required a father figure, and that I should not let my resentment stand in the way of supporting him. Still, I stood my ground. I wasn't going to allow someone to make me feel bad about at last selecting myself. I'd given that woman everything I had, and she'd tossed it away after years of feeling like I would never be sufficient. She could do at least own her decisions instead of expecting me to save her. The calls and mails dwindled down and finally stopped completely over time. It seemed as though everyone at last realized I was serious, that I had moved on and would not be dragged back in. And that is when the actual peace set in my life seemed calm, ordinary in a way it hadn't in years. I had my routines, friends, and job. Though not a luxurious, glitzy existence, it was mine. Then I rebuilt it on my terms. The odd thing is that I once again began to enjoy the small pleasures. Things I had not particularly noticed during my marriage. I would cook my own food, go for walks, and read literature I had intended to read years ago. The freedom was invigorating. I came to see I could live the way I wanted without anyone's permission. I was not, for once, preoccupied with another person's happiness or approval. It felt as though my life had been piecemeal returned. Every now and then, I would stumble across someone knowing both of us, and they would inquire, "Hey, what?" Whichever happened with her, I would politely respond briefly and switch the topic. I was not hiding anything particularly. I simply didn't want to keep going back over a chapter that was so obviously over. She was in my past, and I had at last learned how to leave her there. Regarding her, last I knew things weren't going too well. She was having trouble keeping a job and was flitting between friends' couches and her parents' apartment when her welcome ran out. People I seldom interact with now would message me, sometimes telling me she was seeking assistance from almost everyone who would listen. Some of them even suggested she was expecting I might have second thoughts. Perhaps after all I would come around and choose to play dad to her child. But that was not going to happen. I had spent too much time and effort restoring my life to ever consider following that road. I was not going to be her safety net, or the man who gathers the fragments merely because her intended course of events did not turn out. That chapter was finished. Nothing was going to drag me back. I think I have found the closure I required. She had taken decisions, and now she was coping with the results. And eventually, I felt free as well. Actually, really liberated in a manner I hadn't experienced since the day she departed. I stopped letting her shadow loom over my life. I had moved on and felt good. Not in some great dramatic sense, but rather quietly, blissfully satisfied. Furthermore, you know what? That suffices. Story 3. If she dies, my mother is giving everything to my golden kid brother. I so told her I'm tapping out of assistance for her. All right, now here's the deal. Of divorced parents, I'm the oldest child, and dad as well. Now remarried and off with a whole fresh family, he is living his new life. My mother remained single ever since they broke up. She also is not the kind to seek assistance from anybody but relatives, especially me. She may be independent and live in a retirement community, but figure out who she calls first every time something goes wrong. Living near, I would most likely not have any trouble popping over. Still, this is the important point. I'm hours away. Not like I could just drop over to help her anytime she needed it. Every time she needs me, I have to arrange a trip and a rental car, plan a few days away from my own family, and work from somewhere else. Still, I show up every time she calls, even knowing all that. There are no questions asked. I do now have a younger brother. Less than 10 minutes separate him from her, right in the same city. Does he assist, though? Not entirely. He is around, certainly, but only when he needs money from her, mostly. He swings by, performs a few little favors, and returns when he has what he needs. I have observed this pattern so often that I practically know her better schedule than his. And whenever anything significant occurs, I am still the first person she calls, even now. I am so continually juggling my own life with the next call from my mother. My wife is already speculating on what will happen next since it is so common. Mom is going to need something. My brother will be occupied, so I have to drop everything to go assist. And you know I can't say no, it's my mother. Who else really is going to assist her? She is not going to urge my brother to start acting responsibly and grow up all of a sudden. She experienced a minor auto accident last month, for example. Not really important, but she twisted her ankle. She is not precisely young either. She asks if there is any chance I might come down. She calls me all disturbed and frightened. I so pack, schedule a last-minute trip, and head down. I assist her with everything. Grocery, doctor visits, you name it, when I get there. She is appreciative, of course, and it makes sense to remain by her side. She still has that soft spot for my brother, though, which bothers me. Though he hardly shows up, she treats him as though he were some kind of hero every time he comes up in discussion. As usual, I dismiss it. Well, I remind myself, that is simply how things are. She trusts me. Thus, I am the one she calls. And my brother, the one she flushes about. Truthfully, I'm not sure. She might believe he needs it more. Perhaps she sympathizes with him. Either case, it is always the same. He gets the compliments. I am the one doing everything. One evening, I'm at her house, just finishing off kitchen cleanliness following her dinner. My wife, checking in on everything, is ringing my phone. At this stage, she is familiar with the drill. We chat for a little, and she tells me I'm becoming annoyed. You know, you don't have to be the one doing everything properly. Maybe it's time, she continues, for your brother to start assuming some responsibility. Though I know it's just not realistic, I want to believe that is achievable. Before, I tried bringing up some of these things with my mother, suggesting that perhaps my brother could manage some of them, but she always has a justification. Oh, she will say, he is quite busy. Alternatively, he just lacks your level of responsibility. Every time it seems as though she believes he is unable to handle the demand. I must be the one. And I have to admit that part of me feels good about being the one she depends on. Though it means always postponing my life, it's good to feel necessary. Then, though, there is another aspect. The only exhausted component here. Weary of passing up the lives of my own family. Weary of running down my savings to cover all these hurried visits, and bored of acting as though it doesn't affect me when my brother leaves with so little. My brother then shows up exactly on cue. When she suffered the accident, he skipped the hospital, neglected to follow up when she was seeing the doctor. But here he is stopping right now. She returns home and settles. He walks in, behaves as though he's merely here out of worry. I know better, though. In a few minutes, he is implying some financial difficulties he has been experiencing, as well as how he would benefit from some support. She also falls for it exactly once. My mother is not slow at all. She digs into her purse, grabs a few bills, and hands them over as though it were nothing. I quote Mem standing there observing this entire thing go apart, and I can feel my own anger rising. Not even driven by the money. I mean, she owns this money. She can do anything she wants with it, but given its predictable nature, I flew all across the nation to be with her. And it is him who is getting accolades. I gently try to bring it up with her once he departs, but she dismisses it. She notes he has struggled lately. He is simply getting things worked out. I hold back on pushing it. I simply nod, acting to understand, then return to dishwashing. It's not that I want her to cut off anything either. He is her son as well, and should he require assistance, fine. But it's this sense that I will always be the one doing the labor, regardless of what I do. And he will always be the one earning accolades. I check she has all she needs before I head off that evening. I go over the refrigerator twice, load her with groceries, and remind her to choose her medicines. She hugs me and thanks me. I get the typical shame mixed with pride. Though it's demanding, I know I'll keep going. I quote not sure how to be anything else than the decent son. The person who is always there to support no matter how difficult it gets. But there's this part of me that questions whether she will ever actually view me as more than simply the dependable one. Following that last visit, I return home hoping to somewhat relax back into my own life. Of course, though, the next call arrives not too far off. Mother sounds stressed, and her voice is on the line. As it happens, her financial account was once more depleted by my brother's visit. She is phoning me to let me know she is a little strapped until her next pension check arrives. This is starting to show up regularly. It is the same every time he is here. He pauses for sweet talks or picks whatever money he needs and heads out. And I can't even mention it without her supporting him, saying, oh, he just needed a little help. Alternatively, he is making every effort. And every single time she leans on me to cover the slack later. She's free to do whatever she wants with her money, and I know it's hers. It's just aggravating to see. I mean, here I am, trying my best to see she's all right. I still cover for him, though. He isn't now exerting the same effort. She sees nothing illegal about the circumstances overall. I so moved her some money, enough to keep her going for a little. And so, I feel guilty about it, as this is money meant for my own family, children, or perhaps just for me. Still, comma. What am I expected to do? Let her suffer? I cannot. Though it strains me, I know I will always support her, since really, I'm not sure how to be anything except the dependable one. A few days later, I give her a call to simply find out how she's doing. She sounds better as she relates to me about her week and her handling of things. She quote "s doing great, so I'm happy," but then she begins referring once more to my brother. She notes how he dropped by, hung some photos for her, and cheered her day. I'm standing there listening to her go on and on about him like he's some sort of saint while the phone is pushed to my ear. The person is barely doing the minimal, hence part of me wants to laugh. However, he is treated as a hero for this. I am the one paying payments, planning visits, and organizing her medical records in the meantime. And what then am I given? Just a brief thank you, and turning now back to discuss him. I thus decide to try mentioning it. Mom, I wonder if he might do a bit more. He is right there and might assist with daily tasks rather than merely showing up as needed. She pauses momentarily, then sighs and says, "You know, he's simply not as dependable as you are. I cannot count on him the same way. Still, I am really glad I have you to rely on. It's like both an embrace and a smack. She trusts me more, sure, but she still expects him to go forward. I don't fight with her. Not worth it is what I mean. I just say, sure, I understand, and switch the topic." Inside, though, I have a mix of resentment and resignation, as if I were caught in a job I did not particularly sign up for. And the thing that truly irritates me: she will hand my brother money without thinking twice the next time he needs it. She will then phone me to assist when she's running low. A few weeks go by, and just as I'm getting back into my own schedule, she calls once more. She worries she won't be able to get through the month and needs assistance with some medical expenditures insurance won't cover. Even knowing her response will be, I ask her whether my brother's pitched in. She replies, "He is currently experiencing personal challenges. He is searching for a better job," which, let's face it, is her way of expressing that he has done nothing. I inhale deeply and tell her, "All right, I'll be back to assist you." She thanks me. Even if I'm grumbling a little inside, I can sense the relief in her voice, which honestly makes it worthwhile. Really, I'm not furious with her. She is not responsible for my brother constantly abusing her goodwill. She also probably believes he will grow out of it finally. That is the aspect that most annoys me, though. She is waiting for him to grow into someone dependable, someone like me, but I understand it is never going to happen. At least not as long as she is consistently rescuing him. Following that call, I went to see my wife, who has been observing all of this play out with that blend of understanding and frustration only she could handle. She merely sighs when I tell her what occurred. She says, "You know she will never stop supporting him, and you'll never stop supporting her." Of course, she's right. I find myself caught in this circle whereby I cannot say no since, without my help, I know she will suffer. And then my brother. He has it all worked out. He is aware she will provide him anything he desires, and I'll be the one to step in should he leave her broke. Strangely, actually, how different the two of us turned out. He was only a few years my senior. Still, the difference between us seems like a lifetime. I have a family, work hard, and take great satisfaction in doing things the correct way. He is floating through life, depending on our mother to keep him afloat. She still views him, too, as this struggling child who simply requires some guidance. I go back to all the times I have spent with her. Over the years, all the sacrifices I have made have resulted in missed deadlines, burned through vacation time, and abandoned family activities to be there when she most needed me. And I'm not sorry about it. Though she says it less than I would want, I adore my mother and know she values it. But there's this persistent sense of doubt. This query that keeps resurfacing in the rear of my consciousness. She hardly even notices our differences. Does she grasp what I have done for her? Or is her soft spot for him simply too blinding? I attempt to ignore the idea and persuade myself that it makes no difference. Mom is her, and I will be here should she need me. That quote is as basic as it gets. But that thought continues resurfacing as the weeks pass, and I begin to question whether this will ever change. A few weeks pass, and I'm beginning to believe perhaps things will somewhat cool out. Still, as usual, the tranquility is fleeting. My mom calls me once again, and right at the start. She obviously seems anxious. She is speaking in the same concerned manner that she always employs just before requesting anything from me. She does indeed say that she is once again low on cash. She doesn't say it right out, but my brother's been by lately. At this point, it resembles practically perfect clockwork. He shows up, drains her pocketbook, and puts her in a bind. I then pick up the call. I am therefore listening to her go on about how she feels guilty asking and how she knows it is a lot to rely on me for. She then says, though, "I know I can trust you. You are really consistent. You have always been right there for me." I'm not sure if she's trying to guilt trip me or if she really thinks I'll be there to pick up the pieces. Still, I cave once more anyway. Unknown why. But this time it strikes differently. Sitting there looking at my bank app as I move some money over to her, I can't get rid of this irritation. Not even the money itself is an issue. Though the premise of it is really important. I am not broke. While my brother takes from her with no responsibility, I am spending my hard-earned money repairing her issues. I decide to call her once I have sent the money. I try to have a light tone, not intending to come across as accusing her of anything, but I feel like I should air something on my mind. "Mom, I have been thinking. Perhaps you might chat with him. Let him know he should exercise some more caution with his requests from you. You have a fixed income. Hence, it will be difficult for you to keep covering for him." She pauses, then sighs like I simply do not understand. "Oh," she notes, "he is simply going through a difficult period right now. Actually, he's trying his best. He merely requires some assistance." Though I try to remain cool, I can feel my annoyance mounting. Sure, comma. "But Mom, it's just like every other week. You are running low because of him? I'm just saying, maybe you should impose some limits." Still another halt. She then launches in with her traditional line. "You have no understanding. His strength is less than yours. He wants additional help." She then adds, almost as if she's complimenting you, "You quote, quite responsible. Hence, I'm not worried about you." He, though, well, he simply isn't like that. Not even sure how I should reply to that. She seems to be perceiving him through a prism whereby he is always the one in need of assistance, independent of the damage he creates during the process. And I am also consistent. Respected? After I hang up, the one she can rely on even if it costs my own money. I sit there for some time trying to digest what she said. My head is whirling with this strange mix of resentment and surrender. She most certainly believes she is acting morally by supporting my brother, but it seems as though she is naive to the reality that he is merely taking advantage of her. She does not mean to put me in this position. And what most bothers me, she appears oblivious to the fact that I am here, constantly here, trying as best I can, and all it gets is a brief thank you and a slap on the back before she returns to obsessing about him. I attempt to dismiss it and get on with my day, but eating is driving me crazy. Then, as if the cosmos itself is urging me to face this. That same evening, my brother calls. Right now, this is rare. We don't exactly keep in touch, and when he does, generally he wants something. But I pick up. Maybe he wants to chat about Mom and work things out wrong. He begins with a laid-back hello, and "How's everything going?" Soon after, though, he is grumbling about how difficult things have been lately. Then he smashes me with it. "Could you perhaps loan me a small amount?" "For a few weeks just, guy. As soon as I can, I'll pay you back." I could almost chuckle. Here's this man who has been profiteering our mother for everything he can. Now arriving right now. Most likely from run-through or dry. Though I keep my cool, I feel it's time to gently call him out. "Look, dude, I say I'm not trying to be strict, but do you think perhaps it's time you found another approach to handling things? Mom is struggling, and she finds it difficult to maintain constantly handing you money. I have also been helping her out, but you seem not really pulling your weight here." He finds it unsatisfactory. He starts to get defensive. Start by saying, "Oh, so now you're evaluating me. You have no idea what it is like or his method of attempting to sort things out. It sounds like listening to my mother be sincere. The same defenses, the same deflections. And I understood then and there that none of what I say will change things. He seems at ease. He has Mother to depend on, and he knows I'll be here to cover for her if she can't help. Though the whole thing tastes sour in my tongue, I end the call as gently as I can. Here I am, stooping backwards to keep everything going smoothly as he waltzes through life free from actual consequences. The worst of all is also that my mother lets him go. That evening, I discussed everything I had told my wife about my phone call to my brother, my conversation with Mom, everything. She listens carefully, nods along, and at last adds, "You've done more than enough for them. Setting limits is reasonable, you know. They will survive without you." Though it's difficult, I know she's right. I have this side of myself that feels as though I'm deserting them if I don't help. I have always been the one to get on top of things, to be there. And that maybe, just maybe, I have no obligation to make things perfect. That challenges us. Her words nonetheless stay with me. The sense of obligation I felt during the weekends away from my own family, the vacations I've postponed, And the evenings spent fretting about my mom's money instead of concentrating on my own get me thinking about all the things I have missed. For what then? My brother may thus keep treating her as his personal ATM. Something has to change, I know. I'm not able to keep putting myself last. Cannot keep giving all for those who just view me as the trustworthy one. Even if it's not easy, I believe it's time I start establishing some limits, as much as I despise to acknowledge it, because ultimately, I should be living my own life as well. So following the whole conversation with my brother and the one with my wife, I chose to try something else. I tell myself I'll start enforcing some limits with my mother. First, just little ones. At first, I'm not planning to desert her or something so extreme like that. It's time, though, to quit leaping at every single call. It begins with me somewhat later responding to her text. Usually the second she texts me, I am responding, quickly organizing everything for her. I allowed a few hours to pass this time. Though it sounds little, for me that is a major concern. And sure enough, she starts sending these brief follow-up texts the minute I don't answer immediately. All right, and I want not to disturb you. Though I tell myself it's good to take a breath and she can wait a little bit, guilt starts to weigh in. When at last I do reply, I keep it modest. I attempt to keep the chat light, and I offer to assist with nothing she specifically asked for. She surprisingly seems okay with it as well. She doesn't prod or probe why I took more than usual. She could perhaps be sensing something changing. Alternatively, she might be simply relieved that I am still here, albeit in a lesser capacity. Still, a few days later, the next test arrives. When my mother phones, her tone is once more stressed out. The one typically results in her requesting money. She asks if I might assist her just once since she claims she's been struggling to pay some unplanned bills. Now I know better than to expect it will be only one time. I still stop, though. I consider all the times I have dropped her off, every moment I have spent covering my brother's financial missteps, and I sense that same familiar irritation resurfacing. So I experiment with something different. Mom, I explain, I cannot always cover for you when things come up. Perhaps it's time to have a frank conversation with him about increasing your volunteer work. She goes quiet instead of half expecting her to go defensive or dismiss it. I wonder momentarily whether I have really reached her. She then remarks, though, I don't want to stress him out. He is experiencing difficult circumstances. That is the same old tale. She doesn't want to make his life more difficult or pressurize him. And now here I am. The dependable son meant to just pick up the slack without much thought. I so inhale deeply and tell her, Mom, I will always be here for you. But I cannot keep doing this by myself. Expecting me to manage everything while he merely floats by is unfair. She sighs, then says she will consider it, which, to be very honest, is most likely her way of expressing she won't. I get strange mixed feelings once we hang up. Though part of me feels bad for not acting right away, there is also a slight release. Though it wasn't precisely what she wanted to hear, I really established a limit and stayed to it, perhaps for once. I keep up the limits throughout the next few weeks, attempting to strike a balance between supporting her and avoiding allowing myself to get caught in the same old pattern. Though I can tell she's not delighted, my mom appears to adjust. She phones still requires assistance, but I'm keeping it under reasonable bounds. Following the advice of my wife, I am concentrating more on my own family, and to be honest, it's lovely. I feel as though I'm not totally stretched thin for the first time in a long period. Then, exactly as I'm beginning to believe, this might really work. My mother's close friend sends me a note, someone I haven't seen in years. She says she wants to catch up, but I could sense more is involved. She is not the kind to merely reach out of the blue. She brings it up following the brief conversation and over coffee. She says, I thought you should know that lately your mother has been talking about her. She is deciding some last things regarding everything. I nod without really thinking about it. I assume it's simply the usual. She then adds she intends to hand everything to your brother. Though I'm sitting there attempting to maintain a straight face, internally, I feel as though I just got struck by a truck. All about. She is forwarding everything to him, After all these years of being the one there for her, looking after everything, it is all going to him. Seeing my response, my mom's buddy comments, "I thought you should know. I understand your tremendous efforts for her, and I reasoned you ought to hear it. Not sure even what to say." I simply nod, acting to be okay. But my head is flying. She is forwarding everything to him. The same man who only comes up when he needs money leaves her in a mess each time he's around. Who do I have to replace, including me? She calls me the one she contacts when in trouble, the one consistently there to gather the fragments. She is also devoting all to him. I sit in my car, simply digesting everything after I go. I cannot get rid of this mix of hurt and wrath. Not even concerning the money, is it? I am doing great on my own. She still regards him as the one who deserves all. Despite all I have done, she still sees me as the consistent one who doesn't require anything from her. He is the one she wants to look after over the next few days. If every time I think about it, I feel the same anger returning even if I try to pretend as though nothing is wrong. I have given her so many sacrifices, for the two of them. Quite true. And none of it seems important. All those missed family gatherings, all the tension, all the money I have spent supporting her, she seems to find all invisible. Ultimately, I cannot stand it anymore. I ask her point blank, trying to keep my voice steady, whether it's true she's leaving everything to him. She pauses, then answers, "Well, yes, he needs it more." "You also? You're doing great." "Not at all." Not sure even how to reply. I sat there listening to her say she simply wants to make sure he's good. She knows I'll be okay, but he's always struggled more. And all I can think is she still doesn't see what I have done for her following all this. This notion that he is the one most needed by her still blinds her. And I am only the dependable backup. I'm not with her in an argument. I simply let her know I know, and that I will still be here should she need me. But as I hang up, I feel as though something has at last broken inside me. I just sit there, gazing at my phone after hanging out with my mom. My chest feels weight that I cannot get rid of. A mixture of hurt, wrath, and truth, mixed with a small bit of ambiguity. It feels as though I have done for her all. Ultimately, all the sacrifices and the times I dropped everything to be there meant nothing. She is leaving all to my brother, all. And now I am. The one that has been the conscientious, dependable one. I anticipated to be simply fine with it, because I'm doing great per her. The next few days are a haze. Though I go about my regular schedule, everything seems strange. I attempt to dismiss it, telling myself it doesn't matter. Simply put, it's money. I truly don't really need her fortune. I am financially steady. But it's not about the money. It quotes about her observation of him as the one more in need. She still finds me someone who has everything worked out and doesn't require anything from her. I tell my wife everything at last one evening as we are seated at the dinner table. I share with her the will and my mother's intention to leave everything to my brother. She merely listens, nods along, and then sighs. She says, "You know, you've always been there for her. The one maintaining things together has been you. She could also be so accustomed to it that she is unaware of its expenses. You too." Hearing her say that simply fuels more bubbles of irritation. Sure, I have given up a lot. I left my own family to look after my mom all those years. The money I have spent supporting her since my brother left her pennies. The holidays I missed were needed by her. And what then is my gain? Just the part the responsible son who can take care of himself can play. I go back to all the times I have seen my mother hand my brother money, pardon his behavior, and compliment him for the very minimum. I always dismissed it, persuading myself it had no bearing. But now it seems as though everything has accumulated, and I cannot ignore it anymore. A few days later, my mother phones once more. She's chattering along, sharing with me how my brother dropped by to assist her with a few house repairs. She continues on how great it was to see him, and how hard he is trying to organize his life. And I can't take it longer as I'm sitting there listening to her go on about him as though he were some sort of saint. "Mom," I say, cutting her mid-sentence, "about the will, might we perhaps?" There's a stop, and I can see I startled her. She stammers somewhat, then adds, "Oh well, I didn't see something we should talk about. You redoing well, not bad." I inhale deeply. attempting to keep my voice cool. Mom, it's not about money. It's about you handing everything to him. She sighs like I'm the one causing her trouble after all the times I have been helping her. He more than you do needs it. You are a parent, a consistent work, a life that is going nicely. He still finds difficulty. Though I am frustrated, I push through this wave. And you don't think that perhaps, just maybe, I would like some credit for everything I've done. I have been there for you through all the years, the one looking after things. Long, quiet exists. At last she speaks. You felt that way, and I had no idea. Still, he's always been unique and generally healthy. He requires additional help. And I also assumed you didn't. Hearing that strikes more strongly than I anticipated. She's saying, I never needed her. I don't need her. And all I am good for is to be the one present when none else is. I have to leave, I tell her. Later on I will speak with her. And I hang in there. I sit down that evening and carefully consider what I want. For my brother and mother, I have been stooping backwards. But for what then? Both of them have made it very evident that they consider me as the one without needs, the one able of looking after himself. And truthfully, I find it boring. When my mom calls the next time, she asks whether I could assist with another small bill. My brother seems to have been struggling once more, and she is cash-starved. I inhale deeply, and for the first time I tell her, Mom, I can't keep doing this. She is quiet, as though she expected me to say no somewhat differently. Then she probes, What do you mean? I keep bailing you out every time he takes from you and can't keep. I can't keep putting you and him ahead of my own family and obligations. She begins to object, citing how this is just once and how hard he is working. But Mother, I stop her from finishing. He had been trying for years. Every time you needed me, I was the one there. Perhaps he should be the one looking after you, though, if you are going to keep offering everything to him. The line stops, and for a second I wonder whether I had at last connected with her. She says, nonetheless, I didn't realize you felt this way. You understood, I assumed, and at that point it strikes me. She never is going to change. She will always consider him as the one most in need of her. She will also always view me as the one capable of handling all, without considering it second nature. I decided upon this after that call. I will still remain her friend. I am done, though. Suspending my existence to tidy their messes. I quote, "I'm done, giving up my own time with family or money simply to survive. I'm at last imposing the limit I ought to have established years ago." She tries to reach out a few times over the next few weeks, asking for help here and there. But each time I stick to my guns, I tell her I'm busy and that she should ask her brother instead. She hates it, and I can sense her irritation. However, I know it's for her best. I'm relieved for the first time in a very long time. Years of carrying weight are finally starting to weigh less. The weight of constantly being the reliable one. Still, it's mixed fevers. One side of me longs for various things. She might thereby find worth in what I have done. But for now, I'm concentrating on my own family and life. Day is never coming. Hence, I am not waiting for her or my brother to value what I have done. And at last, putting myself first feels nice, even if it is difficult to do. Although I'm not sure what the future holds with them, for now I'm fine with that final edit. Having kept some distance from my brother and mother, I believe things could be at last calm. Suddenly, though, I get a call from my aunt. I hardly see her very much. I'm really sorry for what's occurring with your mom, so it surprises me when she starts the chat. Ask her what she means, confused, and she drops it. My mother apparently has been telling everyone I've dropped her. My aunt claims that my mother has been telling tales to the family, claiming I left her to take care of things, that I have turned away from her, and that she has nowhere to turn for support. Of course, my brother is an exception. She is portraying me as uncaring, too preoccupied with my own life to look after her. And to exacerbate difficulties already existing. My brother has been supporting her tale and making minor remarks to relatives about how he is doing everything he can to help her, though both of us know he seldom moves a finger. Though it's blended with something new, I sense this familiar wrath swelling up. Tragic betrayal. I had been breaking my back all this time helping her, and doing whatever I could to keep things together. She quote, also going about as though I simply shut her off. It goes beyond simply receiving more family assistance here. It's about guilt tripping me into my former role. She wants me to hear these things, feel bad, and come running back like nothing has ever happened. But this time, I am done. I choose to approach my mother or brother differently rather than approaching them straightforward. I personally contact a few family members who have been incredibly helpful and have seen a glimpse of the circumstances throughout the years. I go over everything. The whole narrative, the sacrifices I have made, the money I have spent to keep her afloat, the innumerable times I dropped everything to assist her, and how my brother has only ever been around to take Dot as evidence. I even sent a few emails and texts illustrating how frequently she has relied on me and how my brother's hardly helped. Realizing how badly they have been misled, his immediate family members start combining two and two together. The narrative of my mother begins to fall apart, and within a week, knowledge of things not precisely as she and my brother have portrayed has leaked throughout the family. When my aunt calls once more, claiming she had no clue it was so severe, a few others apologize for believing the sob story without knowing my side. By now, it's too late. My brother attempts damage control but can't really help. People have seen the evidence, none is buying his. I have been the encouraging one. Although my mother doesn't personally get in touch, I find she is upset via the internet. She quote, annoyed. As if I were betraying her, I introduced her to the family. Not the other way around, with everything out in the clear. At last I feel free. I have no need to explain my limits anymore, and I'm not continuously staring over my shoulder, waiting for the next guilt trip. I terminated ties with both of them to make it quite evident that I will not be attending their games going forward. For the first time in years, my phone is silent. I can genuinely concentrate on my own life, my own family, free from continual being pulled back into the turmoil. Still, I feel guilty knowing my mother would struggle financially, now I'm not here to help her out. I thus choose to arrange a modest, anonymous monthly contribution into her bank account, just sufficient for needs. Not much, but at least I can sleep a little bit easier knowing she won't be left totally empty. She won't know it's from me. And in a sense, it's a comfort I can provide her without allowing myself to be drawn back into her deceptive strategies, without depriving her of the gratification of knowing I'm still there in the background. This time I'm working on my terms, not because she pushed me into it. The familial drama withers with time, probably trying to rekindle things now that he's lost his main source of financial support. My brother makes a few tries to get in touch. I disregard him, though. The rest of the family values my inclination to back off. And I feel quite liberated for the first time. I'm not anymore obliged to be the dependable one, just myself, and that is plenty. Story 4. The 4-year girlfriend of mine turned down my invitation. I first felt ashamed, but I kicked my girlfriend to the street where she belongs once my sister revealed some female code. All right, now here is it. My age is 27. I'm sharing this partly since I have to get it off my chest, and partially do as well. Yes, the way things turned out still surprises me. I had spent 4 years with my 26-year-old girlfriend Liz. 4 years is a reasonable period of time spent with someone you know. She truly was the only one I considered. We got together via a friend. Actually, we clicked exactly from the beginning. Things were laid back and easy. Like, we never get bored and could chat for hours. Someone who just gets you like that is rare. My family. They revered her. Her constant questions would be of interest to my mother. She was fantastic, and even my brothers got along with her, according to my dad. Liz is more than simply my girlfriend. She belonged in a sense already to the family, and it ran both directions as well. When we would all get together, I would occasionally hang out with her little brother, as well as her parents, who I got along really well with. You know, I suppose part of me felt as though we were already halfway toward a family, like it was only a question of governmental recognition. We had a lot of talks about the future, marriage, children, and the works. Every time we discussed it, Liz would brighten. She would begin to dream of our wedding, the type of house we would live in, and the possible number of children we might have. These were not just hazy one-day fantasies either. We had really dug deep, occasionally down to where we wanted to dwell, and even considering certain names for next generations. So yes, I considered us to be solid. I suppose all this is the reason I never truly asked where we stood. We seem to be on the same wavelength. Not a question. And you start to consider the next actions when you are that certain of someone. About 6 months ago, I determined I would be proposing to her. I began to save, research rings, and work out how I would do it to make it unique. I dropped little hints here and there for months, just to thrill her. Though I wanted her to know that something significant was about to happen, I also wanted to keep the entire plan secret. I even joked about her eventually being stuck with me forever. She would laugh and say, "I'm already stuck with you, dummy." I considered that to be encouraging. Let's fast forward to last Saturday. For months, I had been organizing this. I reserved this great resort for a weekend trip, something rather elegant and really comfortable. She was supposed to have a memory she would never forget. I planned all evening and had the ring all set to go. Private supper, view the works from the sceneries. We were going to be just under the stars. I would then ask her to wed me from down on one knee. It seemed to be the ideal scheme. We then arrive at the resort, and everything is running perfectly. Both of us are in a good attitude and savoring the time apart. And I am realizing this is it. This is the time I am at last going to make it happen. I mean, the accumulation was both extremely exciting and causing me terrible anxiety. That evening we go to dinner. I had reserved a small secluded area where we might sit on this balcony with water in view. The area was really beautifully illuminated with candles. She would be over the moon, and this was one of those environments you would find in a romance. Dinner is excellent. We are talking, laughing, and remembering past events. We're both breaking down at one point as she relates to me about a time she got lost in her hometown. This is precisely why I want to spend my life with her, I thought. She's amusing. She treats others kindly. She has this spark that, somewhat improves the feel of life. So after dinner, I at last feel like, all right, time is running short. I reach into my pocket, grab the ring, and begin speaking all this crap I would have practiced in my mind a million times. Things like her meaning to me. How impossible it seems to me to live without her. And all the customary musky fare. And then I asked the question. I was then hoping for perhaps some joyful tears. Big yes, perhaps with some leaping up and down like some proposal videos show. She simply freezes though, like absolutely deer in the headlights. Somewhat startled. She simply looks at me, and after what feels like eternity, my stomach starts to sink. When she speaks at last, it's not a yes. It's more like, could we wait a few more months? I truly had no idea what to say. I simply stared there, startled. Few months. Though perhaps I would have totally misinterpreted the scenario, I believed we were on the same page. She continues attempting to explain herself, stating she just wants more time to be sure she is not rejecting me or anything. She claimed she wanted everything to feel flawless, and she simply wasn't in the correct mental state at that point. This is still a yes, she insisted again. It's simply not yet an official yes. That did not, however, help me feel any better. I simply put myself out there and get met with, "Not right yet." I pushed a smile, nodded along, and tried to keep it together. Inside, though, I was crushed. Here I was expecting this would be this great life-changing event, and instead I found a large question mark hovering over my head. I thought what I had prepared was useless. Her still attempting to comfort me at the end of the night said things like, "I love you and I want this, but I just need a bit more time to make sure I'm totally ready." Really, I wanted to trust her. I really did, but it's difficult to remain hopeful when you've just risked all and the person you love essentially says they're not sure about you. I slept hardly all that night. I kept going back over everything in my brain, wondering whether I would have hurried things or whether I missed any indicators. Perhaps I had ignored her suggestions or whatever, but from where I stood, everything seemed right. I felt like I had been living in some bubble, and then I was just floating about feeling like an idiot. Indeed, comma. That's exactly how the ideal proposal I spent months developing turned out. After that embarrassing, unpleasant evening, our relationship was strange. She didn't flatly reject me, really. It's not exactly what you want to hear, though. To be informed, she needs a few more months. When you are down on one knee, clutching a ring. We left the resort next morning, and the road back home was calm and quiet. Though neither of us wanted to be the first to bring it up, I believe we were both attempting to make sense of what had happened. What do you mean you need more time? I wanted to know. Still, I fretted about her response. I was still ashamed, really, and I wasn't sure whether I could bear another letdown. She started apologizing once we got home. She would say things like, I love you, right? I just need some more time to be sure. Every time she uttered it, it seemed like she was salting a cut. People sometimes get anxious about major decisions, I understand. But this was exactly what both of us wanted. Years of living with her had shown us that we were headed in the same direction. Now she seemed unsure. She kept trying to clarify herself by claiming she had to enter the appropriate mental state. It was very perplexing. Like, what in this context does mental space even mean? She seemed to be dancing around some sort, but she wasn't providing the whole picture. Though part of me wanted to ask her straightforwardly if there was anything else going on, something that would cause her to hesitate, I also didn't want to get an answer I wasn't ready for. I simply closed my mouth and nodded along, trying to act in line with understanding. Still, inwardly, I was experiencing a range of emotions, including anger, empathy, uncertainty. Things seemed tight for the following several days. 1 minute, she would act as though everything was good. Then the next, I would catch her staring at me with a remorseful look, as though she knew she had harmed me. And indeed, she did. Just brushing that off and returning to normal following anything like that is difficult. She would tell me she still saw a future with me, that she still wanted us to be together. But for some reason, it simply felt real less. This continual hesitation seemed to replace that first thrill I experienced. I kept going back over the proposal in my thoughts, wondering maybe I misread something or done something wrong. Was I going too quickly? I paid little attention to her messages, but we had discussed marriage rather a lot before. What had changed truly eluded me. She came home from work one evening and sat me down as though she had a great speech ready. She began talking about how she simply needed a few more months to be totally ready, as though time by itself will bring some kind of mystical transformation in her. She kept saying, "It's me and all that usual, it's not you." She even tried to soothe me by stating we were essentially engaged, but it simply didn't set right with me. You either want to wed me or not, I informed her. Not this complex, should it be? She dismissed it, though, insisting she knew us exactly. Right now, just not right now. Tell me now, how anyone is meant to be comfortable with that? I love this individual and considered myself to be living with for my lifetime. Tell me I'm insufficient for her to decide upon. Starting to get more annoyed, I felt as though she was being led on if she wasn't ready right now. What assurance did I have she would be ready later? Every time I tried to bring this up, though, she would begin to cry and claim she just needed me to understand, and she didn't want to lose me. I felt therefore caught. Between wanting responses and not wanting to aggravate her more. It resembled strolling on eggshells. Though I needed more information, I also wanted to avoid risking driving her further away. I reasoned perhaps she simply needs some time. She could be really overwhelmed and would visit shortly, but I could see myself beginning to surround my feelings with a wall. I started gently withdrawing since I wanted not to hurt much more. I would spend somewhat less time around her. Keep your interactions more surface level and steer clear of entirely discussing the future. Nothing changed, as though I was waiting for her to make the next move, to find out if she would respond straightforwardly. She sensed something seemed strange. And one evening, she inquired whether I was upset with her. I felt inclined to say, "Indeed, I am." I simply shrugged and told her I was good, though. Saying she felt like I was drifting away, she persisted. I said, "Not sure what you expected. I am giving you time since you mentioned you needed it." That caused her to shut down, but the way she looked indicated she understood exactly what I meant. She would put our relationship in flux, and I wasn't just going to sit there and act as though it was normal. Then one evening, it sort of seemed like a turning moment. Sitting next to me on the couch, she began chatting about a major work assignment. She was stressed, and she simply needed everything to calm down before she could really commit. She sounded as though her inability to say yes to the proposition had some sort of connection to the tension from her job. Though I found it incomprehensible, I nodded along. She was clearly struggling, but I didn't know how that prevented her from wanting to wed me if she loved me as she claimed. I was eating at this whole waiting game. Every daily life that passed. I sensed myself veering further apart from her. I had no notion how much time was left. Our relationship seemed to have a timer on it now. And I suppose I became somewhat ready for the worst. I began to consider, what if she never feels ready? Years of investing in this relationship, years believing we were headed toward the same future, and now it felt like I was left in the dark waiting on her to figure out something I believed was already worked out. Still, she insisted she simply needed time, as though that was meant to bring everything under control. And I kept trying to be sympathetic, but my tolerance was running thin. Thinking about how great things appeared just a week ago, I would lie in bed at night, and suddenly it felt as though I didn't even know the person next to me. I knew I would eventually hit a breaking point, but right now I still hoped things would turn around. All right, so at this time, Liz was waiting for her to determine if she was ready to commit or not. Thus, I was caught in this twilight. Every day, I felt as though I was receiving conflicting signals. Honestly, it was driving me crazy. She would seem to be aloof, like she was somewhere else totally 1 minute, then all snuggly and nice. I believed talking to someone might help, since I had nowhere else to spend my time. Still, I wasn't exactly ready to visit friends or parents. Who wants to own that their 4-year girlfriend isn't sure about them? I ended up chatting with my sister. Let me say now, my sister doesn't hold back. She is quite insightful, yet extremely direct, to the point that it can be cruel. She doesn't sugarcoat things. She has this natural ability to read people and circumstances. I set everything out for her then. The plan is the uncomfortable trip back, Liz declaring she needed more time. All the shebang. Furthermore, the response of my sister. She tells me something is wrong right away here, like quite seriously off. She persisted, stating it didn't make sense for Liz to draw back like this after 4 years, especially when we had already discussed marriage so much already. At first, I thought she was just acting theatrically. She wanted to know whether Liz had been acting strangely lately. If her conduct changed at all. And I said, not really, as I wanted to come across as not paranoid. Then, though, my sister struck me with something that made my stomach turn over. "Look at what Liz accomplished," she remarked. "That's traditional girl code for when something else is happening." Usually, a female pauses on a proposal since she wants to leave her options open, and there is someone else in the picture. I wanted not to believe it. This was Liz we were referring about, really? After years of togetherness, I felt I knew her better than anyone. Still, my sister persisted, saying perhaps Liz was already seeing someone else, or at least considering it if she needed time to decide. Deep down, I knew there were small things that hadn't added up lately, but I'd shrug them aside, telling myself I was overanalyzing things. My heart dropped. When my sister noticed I was having trouble understanding it, she related a tale about her acquaintance who had something similar. When she proposed to this friend, her boyfriend had pulled the same "I need time" card. It turned out he was seeing someone else and didn't want to break it off until he was positive he wanted to stay with her. As much as I wanted to ignore that, my sister cautioned me I might be in the same circumstances. It touched too close to home. She answered what I should do when I asked her. Straightforward and basic. You have to probe a little. Ask whether she is hiding another man. If she's not being honest with you, you deserve to be free from this guessing game. I felt disgusted thinking about poring over the life of my own partner. I never dreamed I would be that man. You know, the one who needs to visit his spouse since he doesn't know whether he can rely on her. Nevertheless, my sister was correct. I need some sort of response. I deserved to know if Liz hesitated because of another man. I so started paying closer attention. Though I was not being really wild, that is, following her about or reading through her phone, I did start to notice minor things. She would either take longer than normal to get drinks with pals after work, or get texts late at night and hold her phone somewhat closer than usual. Though I tried not to leap to judgments, these small things began to accumulate, and it seemed as though I was making connections without even trying. One day, she then brought up this man from work, a recent hire to her team. She addressed him casually, noting he was friendly and entertaining to be around, but I observed her expression turn slightly when she spoke about him. Though my mind was racing, I tried to project coolness. I began to question if this was the man my sister had been alerting me about. The whole time. My sister's voice kept playing in my head, reminding me to pay attention and search for the symptoms, and as much as I detested it, I couldn't stop myself. I would ask whether Liz was with him every time she left. I would worry whether it was him every time she would receive a text and grin down at her phone. With the suspicion, I was driving myself insane. However, once the idea surfaced, I couldn't even consider it. At last, one evening, I realized I had had enough. I was done silently sitting about, allowing all these questions to chew me up inside. I questioned her casually about this man from work. She had this protective face straight instantly, as if I had taken her off guard. I made it sound as though I was merely curious, trying to keep up with her life and friends. She said they were just friends and that he was cool to hang out with, so brushing it off, but her response felt strange. And at that, I realized my sister was most likely right. The discussion went nowhere following that. She switched the topic rapidly, but I was beginning to fit bits together immediately. Though there was too much that didn't add up, maybe I was drawing hasty judgments. Though she didn't seem to require time to hang out with this guy from work, I couldn't stop wondering whether she needed time to decide whether she was ready to be with me. The uncertainties evolved into something worse, and I felt as though I was caught in this muddle, unsure of what was real and what wasn't. Here I felt queasy. I was thinking about spending my life with this person, but right now I wasn't even sure whether she wanted the same thing. Not only at her, but also at myself, for not recognizing it sooner since I trusted her so totally that I overlooked all the warning signals until my sister almost had to hit me with the truth. That evening, I sat by myself in our living room, staring at the wall and wondering what the devil I was meant to do about any of this. I hadn't directly spoken with Liz. Hoping she would confess something without my having to probe, I was still waiting for her to come clean on her own. Now, though, with all the elements put out, I couldn't overlook what I was seeing. Though I lacked specific evidence, deep down I sensed something she was hiding from me. Now I was caught with this knowledge, not sure if I should approach her or let things run naturally, hoping she would pick to be truthful. Still, things had evolved between us, and there was no going back. All right, so I find myself nagged every time I see Liz with my sister's remarks lodged in my head. Her whole explanation of the female code concept made more and more sense, and it reached to the point that I simply couldn't ignore it. Though at first I didn't want to believe Liz would act in this way, everything she did appeared to support that germ of uncertainty. I knew I had to sort everything out, or else I would drive myself insane. Though I wanted to be the truth-telling person, I never wanted to be the snooper. So I took her phone one evening. She was asleep. I felt terrible as hell. But at this point, I'd told myself I was only shielding myself from more damage. Heart thumping like crazy the entire time, I slid over her messages, trying not to wake her up. I later noticed it. Notes sent by the man from her company. It appeared at first innocent enough, like nice workplace conversation. Still, I kept scrolling and things started to seem dubious. A few late-night notes seemed far too flirtatious for simply friends. After some travel for business, he texted her a miss-off. She had answered with a me too as they had continued on together, and it was at that point I knew. You do not tell someone you miss them unless something more is happening after all. That evening, I said nothing to her. I returned her phone and simply lay there, feeling ill, and stared at the ceiling. I slept hardly at all. I hardly could look at her the next morning. She behaved as though nothing was wrong, cheery, speaking about her daily agenda, and I was just there, feeling like a hit in my gut. The worst element, I hardly knew she knew either. She seemed to be acting as though everything was good, like we were still the same couple organizing a shared future. I was observing her too, wondering if it was just show. Every small action she took irritated me. She would tell me about her day, and I would start to wonder. Are you spending time with him, or are you truly only at work? Eating away at me, was it? So after a few days of this, I cannot stand it anymore. I asked her to point blank straight ahead. Do you find me still appealing? Like, are you absolutely not interested in anyone else? She looked startled, as though I had just accused her of something absurd. Of course, she said, I am. Why would you even query that? She became defensive though, and I noted that. as she was holding something back. And her face altered totally when I mentioned the man from work. She started to become rather fluttered. I wasn't believing it when she stammered out something about how she didn't want me to worry, and that he was only a friend. I told her I'd seen the messages. I knew she'd been chatting to him late at night, and I felt as though I no longer recognized her. Saying it was simply harmless fun, and that she never really did anything with him, she tried to dismiss it. She insisted that they were only friends, and that she had never crossed any boundaries, but her justifications were getting thinner. She then slammed me with the harshest line yet. I was merely perplexed. I wasn't sure if I was ready to tie the knot, and he was unknown to me, like a diversion and diversion. That is all I was to her right now. Some alternatives were on hand while she considered whether this man from work would be more suited. 4 years of marriage with this woman suddenly made me nothing more than the safe choice as she fluttered about with some colleague. Though at the same time I felt totally devastated, I was enraged. I had been looking forward to a future with her, only to discover she had been wavering all this whole time. Saying it wasn't serious, and that she had only been chatting to him because she was unsure about us, she sought to apologize. She continued saying she was confused and didn't want to hurt me, but you should have been talking to me about it, not some other guy. Which, to be honest, made zero sense. I left the apartment looking for a break and simply drove to attempt to clear my brain. I kept wondering how things had come to this. How could someone who looked so dedicated just flip? And all because she didn't want to tell me straightforward. Right on, my sister's warning. Liz was keeping her options open, waiting to decide whether this man was worth it. The worst of all is also that I stood in for the backup. I returned after my drive, and Liz was there, looking despondent. She had been crying, but I felt numb instead of pitying her. She continued saying she was sorry, and begged me to understand she knew she had messed up. She tried to persuade me she was ready to commit and promised to cut things off with him, thus concentrating on us. How, though, was I meant to believe her? Every promise she gave felt empty. Not sure what to say, I simply told her I needed time to consider. And I turned in for tonight. She was sobbing in the other room, but I was too tired to pay attention. I lie there, wondering if I could ever trust her once more, staring at the ceiling. What I had recently discovered tinged every memory I had of our connection. Believing in a great future with someone not even sure about me, I kept wondering myself if I had been a fool the whole time. Liz was all over me trying to right things the next morning. She made breakfast, kept holding me, and told me she loved me and that she would cure this. But it felt as though I was staring at a stranger. She insisted she hadn't done anything, but I couldn't get rid of the impression she had already betrayed me. I felt entirely supplanted in her life. Physical, emotional infidelity is still cheating. She texted me constantly throughout the day, sending extensive messages on how she planned to make it up to me and how she was going to call off things with the guy. But it was already too late. Already I was beginning to separate, little by little, walling off the emotions I felt for her. Once trust is damaged, it feels as though a fracture cannot be repaired with enough apologies. She sat down with me that evening, vowed up and down that she was going to prove herself to me, that she had broken off all communication with him for good, and that she was at last ready to be with me totally. She sounded frantic and had tears in her eyes, but I couldn't get rid of the impression that I was merely her backup, the safe choice she would keep around while her other options collapsed. Knowing that nothing she said would ever be the same, I sat there staring at her, feeling this mix of resentment and disappointment. Thus, things did not suddenly improve following all that came out. Though they didn't, I wish I could say that her apologies and assurances made me feel better. She was attempting, I could tell. Yes, she was all about proving her dedication and stop texting that guy. I cannot, however, ignore what had transpired. Every time I glanced at her, all I saw was someone who had kept me on hand as her backup. It made no difference what she said. The trust was lost now, and I had no idea whether I could recover. The portion I wasn't anticipating then arrived. 2 weeks after her whole sobbing confession, I felt things were at last settling down. Though I was still not sure, I was allowing her time to show herself. At least that is what I kept telling myself. Then one evening, she returned home looking quite angry. She just blurted out he was cheating on me too, tossing her bag on the table. She hardly even looked at me, not sure even what to say. The irony smacked us both in the face, and the room fell dead quiet. She had been chatting to one of her friends who also worked with that man, and they let it slip that he had been seeing someone else the whole time he was messing about with her. Her eyes revealed the hurt and rage, but instead of feeling pity, I simply felt nothing. Here she was, distraught and crying since her side fling had behaved exactly like she had done to me. All of it was simply ridiculous. She began screaming about her humiliation, how she couldn't believe he had betrayed her, and his dishonesty. And all I could think was, sure, welcome to the club. I don't know. Maybe comfort her, but she finally turned to look at me, expecting me to say something. I just sat there wondering whether she even understood the irony of it all. She then became completely silent, as if she were at last assembling the disarray of the whole scenario. She sat down across from me, inhaled deeply, then apologized. Exactly. I'm not sure what I was thinking. I ought never to have questioned what we had. She then carried out the act I was fearing. She invited me to provide her another actual chance. She felt she should start over. Wanted me to ask her once more for marriage. This time she is totally committed. She actually believed that would solve all of it, that we could simply restart and everything would miraculously be all right. But I already had checked out. At that point, her comments were simply noise. I suppose she may have seen it on my face. You already chose, I told her. You wanted him, and when he let you down, you came back to me. Liz, I'm not some consolation gift. You cannot simply toss me aside when you're not sure, then come back when it would be most convenient. Crying once more, she said she didn't mean it that way. She simply got entangled in something she couldn't grasp. However, I was finished. I told her I cannot live with someone unsure of me all my life. If just now I am not enough for you, I never would be, she pleaded. Attempting to persuade me she was at last confident she had made a mistake. I wasn't having it, though. A word coming out of her mouth made me dubious. I couldn't undo her showing me her actual hues. She wanted to hug me, but I moved back. And that's when the rage surfaced. Starting to accuse me of giving up too quickly. She said I was discarding what we had created over one error. Saying I should at least fight for us, she tried to guilt-trip me, but that just made me angry. You threw us away when you could not even determine if you wanted to be with me or some other man. I informed her, I quote, am not going to sit about waiting for you to decide whether I'm sufficient. She seemed defensive, but she had nothing to say to counter. She realized she had messed up, but instead of owning it, she sought to blame me as well. Like the awful guy I was for not wanting to hang around as her backup, I so told her it was finished. I mentioned I wanted her to go with her belongings packed. Totally startled, she looked at me like I had just slapped her and seemed not to anticipate I would truly call it off. She began to cry, claiming she had nowhere to go and that she didn't know I would kick her out, but I was done. You may find somewhere else or stay with your friend, I informed her. I quote, am not going to pretend here as though everything is fine. You made decisions. I am making mine. She sobbed and urged me to think twice. Still, I remained firm. I was not going to let her spin this around and cause me shame for at last defending myself. She finally understood a bit later. She called a friend to come pick her up, and as she was packing, I simply sat there feeling a strange mix of relief and melancholy. Though part of me wanted to be sad for her, I realized this was her own doing. She collected her luggage, glanced at me one final time, and said, I hope you find someone who can make you happy. Her companion showed up. She then departed. As such, for years upon years together, gone. I had no idea how I should feel. One of me wanted to break down. Another felt this unusual freedom, though, like I had at last started to run my life. I blocked her number and erased all of our photos after she went. I wanted no cues of the mess she had created. It injured. Indeed. However, it also felt like a weight off my shoulders. After spending so much time believing she was the one, I came to see she didn't value me the way I did. And I knew, even if I wanted to, I couldn't go back. I'm still sorting everything after a few days. I become enraged at her at sometimes. Other times, I blame myself for not recognizing it sooner, but I know this was the right choice. Not someone who has to test the waters before deciding what to do. I deserve someone who really wants to be with me, indeed, that is how everything came to pass. Not with some great farewell or major confrontation, just a quiet, messy ending to something I imagined my future would be. Though difficult, I know I made the correct decision. Liz packed and departed almost a month ago. Therefore, post. Though every now and then I receive things via mutual acquaintances or those still in contact with her, I have done my best to move on. The last is apparently, karma returned and struck her hard. She attempted staying with her buddy, who had picked her up not long after she left, but it didn't last. That pal helped Liz out first, just enough patiently, but the situation grew old. Liz perhaps leaned a little too much, and her pal had things to deal with. After getting the boot, she was not about to keep Liz's fallback strategy permanently. From then on, Liz was forced to return to her parents' house. And from what I have heard, that too didn't go very smoothly. As it happens, her parents were really let down to learn what she had done. They liked me, and they wouldn't have appreciated learning how she mistreated someone they felt would be a suitable match for her. I suppose they didn't want to deal with the aftermath after realizing how much havoc she had created. She couldn't hold down a place to stay or truly demonstrate to them she'd learned anything, even if they advised her to get our act together. They finally advised her she had to go somewhere else for residence. She is thus essentially alone and without direction right now, the man she had played about with in the office. Her pal claims he's long gone and moved on already. She has attempted getting in touch with a few other people, but most of them only want to keep their distance and are consumed with drama. She has discovered the hard way that you cannot continue to regard individuals as choices devoid of repercussions. Though not enough to act upon, part of me feels a small pity for her. She decided on something. She chose to toss all we owned in search of something obviously not worth it. She is now left juggling the consequences as well. She reportedly has been hopping around aimlessly looking for somewhere to crash. And I'll be honest as well. Knowing she is paying for her actions gives one some gratification. Funny how sometimes things turn out. I would have done anything for her a few months ago. Today, I feel very little. Simply a sense of satisfaction that I escaped before wasting even more time on someone who didn't appreciate what we had. I'm not looking back.